Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. Looks like we still have a few more people looking to log in, so we're going to go ahead and wait for a few more people to log into Zoom. While you're waiting, I just want to let you know that if you have any questions or any comments or feedback that you'd like to share with us, like sound quality or slides or anything like that, feel free to go ahead and post that in the chat box. My colleague and I, Knuckle, will be monitoring and making sure that we have quality sound and images available for everyone. And if you have a question with regards to what you're seeing, we are going to have a Q&A section at the end. Feel free to go ahead and post those in the Q&A section. And the difference between both of those is that the Q&A section actually will generate a transcript which we can use to do follow-up after the webinar. So again, if you have general feedback about the webinar in quality itself, go ahead and post that in chat. And then if you'd like to ask questions about what we're going to discuss today, put that in the Q&A section, and my colleague Nicole and I will be following up. All right, so we do have a few more people here. We should wait probably one more minute. So we'll start right at 11:02 Pacific time. That's 12 Mountain time for Ken, and then Eastern time, that's what, 1, 2? So yeah, we should be getting started here very soon. Thank you. All right, so it's just a little bit after 11:02, maybe closer to 11:03. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Esther Lavia. I'm just here as a moderator, but I want to welcome you all to our first CX webinar of the year, 2020. And our topic of today is observe from the outside. Don't analyze customer experience data in isolation, which I think is kind of funny because right now a lot of people are being isolated, yet in CX, we don't want to do that. So with that, I want to introduce you to Ken Peterson, who is the CX president here at QuestionPro. And with him, he has Tim Cunningham, who is a professor over at St. John University. And go ahead, you guys have any, again, as I said earlier, if you have any questions, comments, go ahead and post.
What can happen, as well as how you can approach that from a CX perspective of bringing in more insights. I'll start with a brief introduction about myself. Ken Peterson. I was told one time many years ago, when it didn't make sense to me, that once you get so much experience, you just say 20 plus years. And so I am now at that category of 20 plus years and counting. I've been a research executive, project management, analytics. I've worked across the board previously with Ipsos and a company out of Sweden called NEPA. And I think one of the things that I'm fond of myself as a technologist is that I've worked with all the major technology players in the CX space, which is it's been a lot of fun, enlightening, and learning. I will turn it over to Tim and let him introduce himself briefly.
Hi. I'm Tim Cunningham. I am a professor of marketing at St. John's University, and I also have a role at the research firm Rockbridge Associates as their Chief Client and Strategy Officer. But prior to becoming an academic full-time, I spent not quite 20 years, Ken, 17 years at Ipsos, the last 7 as the Global Chief Strategy Officer of the Loyalty Division. And anyway, I'm happy to be here. And I've worked with Ken in the past, full disclosure, and Ken was one of the best guys I've ever worked with.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. So one of the question of the day that I wanted to start with, and if you looked at the brief beforehand, it's where do things go wrong with companies starting or restarting their CX journey? And I mean, for that, I sort of have this core belief that there are 5 elements to CX. Taking that road to client satisfaction, and that you have to be able to measure, engage. That means frontline. That means your employees. Closed loop is very critical. Being able to close the loop, and it's not always just responding to complaints. It's also making them promoters. I mean, we measure net promoter score so much. We want to actually make sure that those promoters are promoting. And then I'll shift over to culture shift real quick. You have to have a real shift in the culture, and I recently wrote a little article on LinkedIn about that. Sometimes that shift in culture really has to come from the top. Part of it is analysis, and all too often that's an overlooked area. And so, I sort of want to just go down that first path of, let me start with you, Tim. You have so much experience. Your opinion on this first topic. Where does CX go wrong as people start down that journey?
There's a lot of places that, well, it's a great idea, and everybody buys into the great idea. It's that the customer experience is the reason you are in business, and that's true. And the problem is that we too often pay lip service to it without really understanding the complexity of it, and that becomes a problem. So CX has become the be-all, end-all for too many people, in the sense that it becomes the theory of everything, and the theory of everything can't win. And even, and I'm guilty of pointing to kind of the difficulty with CX. I've written some papers and things like that on it, and you end up with, kind of the academic definition being it's the cognitive, emotional, physical, sensorial, and social elements of the customer's direct or indirect interactions. And that's a snooze fest for any manager when you think about it. And it also says it covers so many things that how do you actually make sure that's really going to happen for you? The reality is that we tend to measure with single type items, customer feedback measures, which we obviously need, but we tend to focus on a few, and as opposed to having kind of a more holistic approach. And that can get you messed up, because it's like anything. If you focus on only part of what it takes to be successful, whatever it is in your life, whether it's in your business life, or let's think about being an athlete. You can't focus on a single element to be a world champion in anything. You have to have a more balanced approach, and that's hard because the measures are being evolved, and we still are debating, what really matters. Right now there's the big debate of, do we want to measure? Do we want a meaningful experience or a memorable experience, or do we need a frictionless experience? Just think of that as one break. And there's lots more than that hasn't been taken into account or figured how we're going to address it properly. But anyway, I'm sure you have lots of stories about where it goes wrong, Ken.
Oh yeah, well, and I think one of the things that you mentioned, that we sometimes oversimplify it, and I think one of the key measures that a lot of companies look at today, the NPS, which really does simplify it, bring it to the masses, possibly is guilty of also making us oversimplify the situation a little bit, in that we then start looking at that one measure and think it correlates to everything. when you have to correlate to a lot more than just one measure to say you're being successful in CX. And I think there's obviously plenty of measures that you can look at, but if I'm going to disconnect from CX measurement for a moment, and I always it's one of my favorite stories. We were presenting to a potential client several years ago who works in hotels, and they were pretty diligent about when we showed up. They all checked all our names against their loyalty database. And it was interesting because they started with someone and said, "Oh, well, you've only stayed 2 nights in our hotels in the last year." The person said, "Well, I don't travel that much, and most of my time is spent in the Northeast if I do travel, so I don't have to go very far, and I can go home every night." And they said, "Okay." And then someone else, they said, "Oh, well, you have 20 nights. You're almost a silver. What's stopping you?" Yeah, if I had 1 more week of vacation, I'd probably hit those 5 more nights, kind of thing. So then they turned around to me and said, "Wow, you're actually one of our most loyal customers. We love to have your business because you're spending over 80 nights a year in our hotels." And they were gushing with the pride that they had in having someone in the room that was at their top loyalty status. And I always say they were looking at that in isolation, because I asked them the question. I said, "So you think I'm very loyal to your company?" And they said, "Yes, absolutely." And at great risk, I actually asked the question, "What would you say if I told you I spent fewer than half my hotel nights in your hotel chain?" And it was pretty quiet in that room for a moment. And it just goes to show that sometimes you have to look outside the data that you have, whether it's CX, whether it's your loyalty data, sometimes even profit data. You have to go beyond that. So, financial metrics are always a key source of information that can be linked to CX outcomes and such. So, but it's not always easy to make that direct link. Sometimes I think for most of our organizations, it's very difficult to even acquire that information. I have some examples of operational KPIs. What are some of the key measures that you see as important when you're looking at CX metrics, for example?
Well, a lot of the things that I think that this gets back to your example gets back to a thing that I find that's the main source of competitive advantage that hasn't been exploited properly, and that's context. And in this case, your example is the competitive context, which is great, because if you don't take that into account, you never understand the share of wallet that's coming to you, and actually, how they're trading you off vis-a-vis competition. But so I personally think that that's a big one, and I like how you mentioned hotels. It's funny. It's going to sound like we planned this, but I had no idea that was the example you were going to use. But the reality is, less than hotel guests spend less than 50% of their nights at their preferred brand, and that's not me. That's a Deloitte study, right? And it was like, okay, that should tell you something, right? Context plays a role in it. And so let's just stay on your hotel example. Context plays a role also in the sense of environmental context. So Ken, going back to being on the road, let's do a different one. You're in Detroit, and it's a major snowstorm, and all flights out of Detroit are canceled. You probably need a hotel room. But what you need from a hotel room is very different than what you needed from a hotel room when you planned your stay. When you said, okay, I know I'm going to be staying at X, I'm flying to XYZ city to have some meetings. There, you actually plan out where, a whole bunch of different demands for the hotel. But those change, when you're stuck. It's not the same as a vacation. Vacation hotel, you definitely have different demands from the hotel than you do for business. But stranded passenger has a very different need. They're probably more concerned with close to the airport, safety measures, those sorts of things, the ability to get back to the airport in time for the flight, their new flight the next morning. All of those things matter, and yet we tend to advertise or tend to plan our service or measure our service for a single context, and that can be a problem. So, you know, if you're a hotel that's that is set up near the highway, and most of your or a significant percentage of your customers are highway travelers who are making choices at the last minute because they're really looking to see how far they can travel until they decide it's time to pull over and find a place to stay. Well, their context matters a lot, because if you're going to try to get your guests to come, they have to know you're there. How do you get to know they're there? I always like the story of Red Roof Inn. Red Roof Inn figured out that they couldn't compete, or they needed to measure things and see how compete with the big brands in terms of advertising dollars. So they started tracking traffic patterns at certain times of day, because what they found out was, if I monitor those sorts of things, I find that traffic patterns ultimately impact when people want to stay. Certain times of day, traffic's tight, they don't want to travel. They start to look up on their phone where they want to be, and then you say, okay, here, you know, our hotel is, you know, within 5 miles or whatever. Here's how you get there. And they paid to get the top building on the ads. And then they monitor, you know, what those types of guests want, and they stay with them throughout the process. But they make sure that that first part of the context is measured and brought into the data. And then they stay with, they monitor the type of guests they have in. They know exactly what they want with what it is that they're looking for. You know, these sorts of patterns matter. You know, and if you're a retailer, you know, when people come in, and the type of weather conditions just coming into the store impact their perceptions of the experience. You have a different experience coming in from the rain than you do coming in from the sunshine. It's just how it is. I know I'm getting too granular, but all of these things are doable. You can pull them into your systems, and you can track these customers. You can track the times of day that they're in with you, and you can pull in these external pieces of information, as well as competitive information. The customer is even willing to give you competitive information to come up with a very good sense of how that experience is, whether it's frictionless and whether it's memorable and all the other pieces.
That's terrific. And I think you mentioned a few things like weather. Sometimes you also have runs because of threats of pandemics, things like that, that ultimately influence what people can get or not get. But weather is one of those great ones that certainly, as someone who's living in Colorado right now, really doesn't affect us when a big snowstorm is blowing in. But I spent 7 years in the Northeast, and you could see the rush that would happen with a threat of a snowstorm coming in. And those shelves were empty, the stores were full, and it's a very different experience that I don't think people really look at it and go, well, that was a bad experience, because it is that context within it. So I think one of the others, and it's, you know, this could tie in weather. I spent a lot of time in sports fan experience measurement, those kinds of things. When you're measuring it, the biggest factor in all of it is always sort of the win-loss. I mean, you can't, you know, the fans have a great time when you win. They have a terrible time when you lose. And it's one of those things that if you're looking at your fan experience in isolation and just saying, how'd everything go? I think you end up with missing a big part of the picture. But you know, then it's important to get the context of everything else that was going on, because there is different factors within that experience that you can really, you know, drill down, connect it, and pull it all together. And you know, ultimately, unless you're the WWE or maybe the Astros, your games aren't fixed. So you're able to, you know, you're not able to affect that portion, but affecting everything else you can. And then of course that external element that you can't rely on. And anyone that goes to a baseball game will know that sometimes they get rained out, and sometimes you leave that day very disappointed because either they didn't play a full game, or I've gone so far as gone to New York to go to a baseball game and have it rained out and not be able to go back at all. So sometimes those things happen and they're disappointing, but that context, it's important to relate it and bring in those factors. The more factors that you can control in a situation are always better, I think. So we talked about competitive context a little bit, and I see this frequently. Tell me why you think industry baselines are important in the context of CX.
Because you can fool yourself into thinking you're doing a great job, when in fact, your example with the hotel is a great one, right? You were their top customer. The fact of the matter is, your best customers are also your competitors' best customers. It's always true. It's always true. It's one of the, for those who are, there are a group of people, particularly in academia and certain types of brand management, who argue against the customer experience entirely. And they argue it for exactly the same reason you just talked about. And that is, well, the reality is heavy users are heavy users, and they're not just your heavy user, they're everybody's heavy user. So if you buy lots of groceries, you probably buy lots of groceries from more than one grocery store. That's just how it works. And buy lots of clothing, you buy lots of clothing from lots of different clothing stores. And so their argument becomes, it's that context that drives everything, or that sense of the penetration within that buyer and that buyer's proclivity to purchase in the category. Obviously, Ken, you and I are of that ilk. I mean, it's important. That part is very important. But my view is, if you have industry benchmarks, you're able to understand what it is that drives different behaviors, and what it is that drives your from being first choice or second choice. And there's a huge difference between being first and second choice in terms of how all customers divide their share. And you won't really know that without getting a sense of what really is good. And let me give you an easy example. We did a lot of work in the past for firms in a Latin American country, Chile. Okay, and so you look at the Chilean pharmacy market. So think CVS and that sort of thing. They all have terrible experience ratings relative to other types of industries. They're certainly not Disneyland, right? But they're not terrible relative to each other, all right? And so if I try to say if you look at your score out of context, and you just look at the score you got for how people are feeling, well, people don't tend to go to a pharmacy because they're feeling good. They tend to go because they're feeling bad. And you naturally will get people to say the experience was less pleasant, right? Because your aches and pains transfer onto your feeling about the whole experience. But the reality is, they know the difference between the way they were treated at one pharmacy versus another. And so by knowing the benchmark, you now don't sit as a CEO, you aren't making statements of, we need to get these numbers to something that's not possible, at least not possible given the current environment in which they live. You can set objectives that are realistic. You can also make sure that you're winning vis-a-vis your main competitors. That's a really important issue. So again, it gets back to a different type of context. Now it's a market context, right? Where are we in the market? And only with industry benchmarks do you know where you are in the market.
Yeah, and I think, you and I both know the person that said this. We won't name names, but I remember way back early in my career, someone saying, great business insights rarely come from a single source of data. And I think, that's pivotal in what you're saying for the industry benchmarks, being able to say how we compare to others and tie it into the measurement that you're doing internally. So I know, just because I know you so well, AII was just featured at the AMA Winter Academic Conference. So I was hoping that you could take a few minutes to tell us a little bit more about AII and give us some more information about that.
Yes. And by AII, Ken is referring to the American Innovation Index. The American Innovation Index is the only national barometer of customer perceived innovation and social innovation in the United States. It's actually it was formed as a partnership, or I should say, a group to gather three institutions. Fordham University is the academic face of the American Innovation Index in the United States. NHH stands for is actually the Norwegian School of Economics. It's the premier school in Norway. And they were actually the creators of this innovation index. They started years before to validate the metrics, to make sure all the measures were robust and that they were capturing what they intended to do. And then it was rolled out in the U.S. Rockbridge is the research provider that gathers and analyzes the data to put this together. So all of these entities together are responsible for the American Innovation Index. It looks at perceived innovation and the measures that constitute that. So think about it being has innovative products basically, and it looks for it has kind of innovative ways of thinking. But that wasn't the only thing that we wanted in there. In the U.S., we recognize that innovation, absent social innovation, isn't really, it doesn't make sense in terms of solving the world's problems. And so to support the UN Global Compact, which is a group of measures designed to alleviate some of the the biggest systemic problems in the world, we believe that adding a social innovation component was important to the American Innovation Index. And so there you're looking at measures of innovation that are designed to capture the social good. Are they solving systemic, societal, or environmental problems? Are they contributing to their communities? And this is all perceived by the customer. All other measures of innovation are done by expert opinion or some sort of tallying of things like patents and things like that. Not that those things aren't important, but in the end, the argument that we make is that innovation only matters if the customer perceives it as a benefit to them. That's it. And so we measure, I want to say, 20-something different industries. It covers most of the US GDP. We've had the Innovation Index winners now 2 years in a row. And the first thing that we noticed about it was what customers perceive as innovative and what experts perceive as innovative isn't always the same thing. Now, obviously, sometimes it is. I mean, you'll see an Apple, right, or an Amazon, but you'll also see things that you wouldn't expect to see in terms of innovation and social innovation. You know, Chick-fil-A has been in the top 20 most innovative and socially innovative firms 2 years in a row. And we're talking about a maker of a chicken sandwich, or Trader Joe's, or even Aflac. And it's very interesting. Remember that when we look at how this is done, it's customers telling us what matters and whether or not the company is truly innovative. And you see IKEA in the middle. And IKEA, it sounds like, well, that's not going to be, that's an anomaly, but it's actually not an anomaly. it's actually number 1 in Norway. And I'm sure it'll be number 1 in Sweden as they roll it out in Sweden. So what you see is that the people who shop there actually have a sense of what innovation is and what social innovation is. When we did this the first time, the most innovative company in the United States in 2018 was John Deere. And we thought there must be something wrong here.
Yeah, that one surprised me. Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out that everyone who, so we actually had to go out and check to make sure that you always go and check to make sure there's nothing wrong with the numbers. John Deere customers tend to be fanatical about John Deere, because John Deere not just advertises, but it actually employs and runs its company with the view of, we are stewards of the land. Our job is to, largely to help farmers, but obviously they have construction equipment and your lawnmower might be there, but their deal has always been about innovating to make it better to feed people. That's in their blood. And even when they talk about how they hire people, which was great. We had the head of their social innovation come and speak, and you learn so many things about the way they've done it. He would make a joke, because you have all these automakers being perceived as innovative or socially innovative, particularly because of the electric vehicles and the emissions standards they're fighting to, or I should say, the reduction in emissions that they're trying to accomplish. But he made a joke. He said, you're all talking about self-driving cars, getting ready for that. We've had self-driving tractors for 20 years. People don't drive it. The tractor can go by the GPS. He goes, we had to refine the GPS systems to a level that is beyond what they're supposed to be able to do, because we had to be within a foot. And he goes, we got AI and photo recognition on our systems, because we wanted to use less pesticides on the land. So we would go out and we'd look, we'd have to take a picture of the plant. Plant's got to have, plants look different, whether it's sunny, rainy, whatever, has to identify whether it's a weed or whether it's a plant you want. And if it's a weed, you spray it and only it. And if it's a plant, you leave it alone. He goes, think of what that does for the environment. And all of their, and they advertise heavily why they would do that. So it's not just that they're innovative. They make sure their customers know it so that they can actually tie into that, and they can internalize that they are buying a brand that cares about what they care about, making and it works for them. And so I look at these things, and Chick-fil-A, the reason Chick-fil-A, we spoke to some managers at Chick-fil-A, and they would talk about, their real goal is, how do we serve the community? Now, granted, they get lots of bad press for some of the things their founder has said. I don't want to get into the middle of that, but their customers are passionate about their community involvement. And in the end, you're just making a chicken sandwich. So their view is, we need to compete by being a part of the community. These are the kinds of things that are unique. What I loved about the getting the innovation, social innovation, when you look at innovation, naturally it's going to, customer perceived innovation correlates very strongly with customer loyalty. You see that in the data consistently, and so obviously some people will go, well, of course it's all in the same survey, whatever, and of course that's how it would look, right? So you would have, if you're an academic, you'd say, well, you probably have some sort of common method thing happening here. And, there probably is something to that. So that's why we look at it, try to connect it to external measures. And so what we did was we looked and said, okay, well, how does the American Innovation Index look relative to abnormal returns, abnormal stock returns? And Ken, I think you have a slide there for that. Is it showing, Ken? There we go. And what you're looking at here is, this is early, so we're still doing, we don't want to be out here saying that we found the the one number you need or whatever. We're very serious about the science being rock solid, but the early results are showing a very strong relationship. So we have about a year and a half's worth of data in terms of linking to abnormal stock returns, and you see this S-shaped curve. And the funny thing is, what you see is that if you are not socially innovative or not innovative, you're tanking in terms of abnormal returns. And it's only when you get to a very high level that you get a return that is much greater than the rest of the market. But the funny thing about social innovation is social innovation plays a really important role. Clearly, you go to a firm and you buy because they satisfy the needs you came for, whatever that is. You go to a grocery store, you don't go, well, are you feeding the hungry or whatever. You don't actually say that first. You say, do you have the products I want? But if it fits if it helps to, if you're very, very good at social innovation and it corresponds to fulfilling your mission, and you are better than most firms, then social innovation helps. But if you are not, then your stock returns drop dramatically. And it might not look like much. And that's because the curve is so sharply drops at being not innovative or socially innovative. But if you look, if you are in the bottom 50% in social innovation, it takes a lot. It has a huge damper on abnormal returns. You don't have abnormal returns until you're so innovative that it compensates for you. And so what this says is innovation and social innovation work together hand in glove. You can be innovative, perceived as innovative, and you'll get a benefit for being innovative and not socially innovative, but you will get less of a benefit than you should. You really win when you're both perceived as innovative and socially innovative. Now, the funny thing about this, if you don't have an industry benchmark, you have no idea where you really stand. Because this isn't abnormal returns within your industry. Well, abnormal returns are done within the industry. But the reality is the actual innovation and social innovation score is relative to everyone. Being in the top 50% or bottom 50% is top 50 or bottom 50% of all firms tracked by the American Innovation Index. So absent knowing where you really play, it's impossible to assess how innovative you really are in customers' minds vis-a-vis your competition and also vis-a-vis the very best in the market. And in many things, you are being compared with the best in the market. The reason delivery times for everything have shrunk is because Amazon has made all of them shrunk. You don't think in terms of, well, that's not how we do it. The big question now is we have no choice. The industry is being driven by top players, or all industries are being driven by top players, perhaps even in other industries. I don't want to take all your time, Ken, but is there anything more to say?
I think that's important to point out, that being able to make that connection and being able to say, when you start looking at returns and profit and CX and what you're doing, being able to make that link is important. And I'll translate it slightly into an area where we probably don't think about as much, although they are the drivers of CX, and oftentimes is employee engagement, employee experience. When you start looking at the marketplace for employees, guess what? They are looking for those socially innovative companies as well. So it's no surprise that some of the companies that you saw on the index are also some of the, I'll call them the employers people want to work for as well. So, when you start tying all those things together, and it does tie back pretty closely, and the correlations are very strong.
Absolutely. It's funny you would say that. That's the first thing that many of the firms that are interested in innovation actually want to tie it back into their employees' perceptions of their innovativeness, because of for exactly the reason you just said. I don't want to I feel like it feels like a setup, but people don't realize we didn't talk about this at all. But that's absolutely right.
Well, well, and I think sometimes the truth is the truth, and it doesn't matter if how you view it. But coming back to it, when people see innovation, when they see people being treated well, when they see that social side being met, and the experience being curated by a culture that cares about the customer. Sometimes it's not the customer is always right. It's just that they care about the customer. It really does all tie back together. So I want to wrap up here in a moment and make sure that we have some time for some questions. Clearly, the innovation side is really important. But let's go beyond that, and beyond the innovation. What do you see, past, present, future, the three key elements for creating a great customer experience?
Oh, Ken, I think you actually probably could do this better than me. I'm so tied into the complexity of the academic research right now. I personally am very, very tied into thinking about the things that we aren't doing a good job of thinking about. In fact, we're actually coming up with kind of trying to give it a new nomenclature for what we call touch points and context and qualities. And I know that that sounds really academic, but if we don't actually get a sense of the nature and the control of the touch points that our customers have with us, a lot of the touch points that our customers have with us can still be outside of our control. So think in terms of online platforms for booking that hotel that you go to. Let's go back there, right? You don't have really any control over it, and yet that impacts your experience. And I don't think, I personally think that the big wins are going to come from those revelations of context, right? Where we really start saying, okay, what are the different times that, or different factors, I should say, that impact when people want to come, and what do they want. I loved your fan experience one. The reality is the fan experience is one that's driven by social context. You usually go to the game with people you care about, right? And that social context, you need it set up to, if you need a way of measuring not just how you feel, but all the, how do they perceive their ability to make this a great, whether it's family or friend experience, where they're together to make that happen. And these qualities, there's a whole bunch of things that, we have to remember that there are different types of services out there, and some of them need to be more frictionless, particularly those that are kind of particularly ordinary, right? Some things, we don't think a lot about. We're not expecting the magic kingdom. Other things, though, we are, right? And they can even be technically in the same category. Food service is a great example, right? Not all restaurants are designed to serve, have different degrees of ordinariness. I think that if we don't get that sense of how to get those in, I think we're going to have trouble. And so that's where I'm seeing the breaks, because I think we're pretty good at measuring how happy people are. The problem is we're not really good at measuring how they really, how they pull all these pieces together. So for me, my goal is to simplify that process, come up with some key steps and metrics that can happen to make that happen. But if you want to say what's the one thing that you should do, because it would be easier for me in making a customer experience, it would be really, get outside yourself and shop your own store. Shop your own store.
It's amazing how
by that,
often that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry. I know you have probably some really great examples of experience, factors that make a successful experience.
Well, I mean, for me, I look at where the industry, particularly data, because I'm a data person, both from a technical and an analytical side. I think the data is evolving in a sense that we should, measurement is important. There's an aspect of measurement that when you're measuring, you can't capture that opinion otherwise. It's not always through a survey. Sometimes it's through social media. Sometimes there's different brands out there, but there's sometimes those kiosks. My favorite ones are right after you leave TSA. They have a kiosk there that has the buttons. How was your experience today? And is it ever going to be great? Probably not. I've had some good experiences, but not great experiences. So I think being able to take that kind of I'll call it attitudinal, that feeling, the emotional aspect of it, and tying it all into all these other sources of data that are already there. All too often, I've seen surveys. I remember one that was 40 minutes long for a customer relationship study, and I'm thinking, who stays on for that long? Well, the people did stay on that for that long because that relationship was important for them, but not everyone has that. And so I think bringing all those pieces together in a more efficient, more effective way, tying it, I mean, there's so much data available between I always like to say between weather and industry benchmarks, there's a lot of data in between that you can bring together and make it happen. I think as we move forward in a more digital world, we're going to see that connection happen. I think the last thing I'll point out, you can't leave the employees out of the equation. I think you and I had done some research on this previously. I mean, this is way back in 2004, probably.
Yep.
That connection between the employee experience and the customer experience can't be unwoven. And you're able to see that the employees have a huge impact, and especially in a marketplace like today where there's a lot of upward and sideward mobility for employees, it's important to make sure that that connection is not only realized and understood, but actually capitalized on. So those were my thoughts. With
They're
that,
great. All right.
I will, Esther, if you're there, I will see if we have any questions to answer.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you so much, Tim, for that presentation. I certainly learned a lot about the reasons why we need to step outside and see what customer experience really is like from the outside in. So thank you very much for that. I do have a few questions from the audience. Let me go ahead and read those to you. And also, anyone that's still online, if you do have any questions, feel free to go ahead and post those. Like if you have questions about how to get started with CX, or you're having trouble, what are some best practices and insights that you can get? This is a great time to speak to experts in this field. So let's get started with the first question here. I have this one that's saying, with so much being spent on CX, why doesn't CX companies already have industry benchmarks?
That's a good question. I think, and there's some limitations to that. I think it's sort of that outside in look again of when you have industry benchmarks that say if we took all of QuestionPro's clients and lined up their measures and said, okay, well, we have industry benchmarks. I think ultimately you're left with gaps. Because you are again measuring the customers that you have within that industry or within your client base. So I mean, I know there's quite a few out there that really do have a robust set of clients, but you're still met with that gap of we've measured. I mean, can you imagine if you measured McDonald's, Burger King, and Popeyes, but for some reason you left Chick-fil-A and Wendy's out of that industry benchmark? I mean, that would be huge for two different reasons. Wendy's being such a predominant player, Chick-fil-A being, as we've learned, a very innovative player. I do feel it's important to get a robust set of industry benchmarks.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So let's go ahead and go to the next question here. Or before I go, Tim, would you like to add to that at all?
No, I think that Ken was right on. I was like, okay, I'm waiting for the hole, but there isn't one.
All right, sounds good. All right, so let's move on to the second one. Are companies already overspending on CX? Wouldn't this add more cost?
Um, well, a lot of economic questions here today. The I think the reality is, yeah, we're sometimes you are overspending, but I'm not going to call it overspending. I'm going to call it right spending. I think there's a certain element of Tim had mentioned it, sort of alluded to it earlier. Of there's a um, you get a measurement tool up and you think, okay, well, we're doing good. We're on this path to CX, and I think it's beyond that. I mean, I've always said, CX is not a destination; it's a journey. You keep going, and so oftentimes a lot of effort, both budget wise and I'll even say emotional effort is put into getting a program up and a CX program up and running, and it's stuck in the measurement side of it. And it is one of those areas that if you're just measuring, you're probably not doing enough. And if you're spending your entire budget on measurement, then I would say definitely you're not you're you're overspending on measurement and you're not right spending. I know that sounds odd coming from a company who offers a technology platform to measure CX, but the reality is you need to be able to have something in there left over to be able to analyze that data, to bring in industry benchmarks, and fight internally to get access to that data that makes it relevant. So many times I've worked with clients where they have the measurement, someone else has the loyalty data, someone else has the spend data, and no one's bringing it together. And I'm going to say right up front that is not a very customer centric culture. If you have silos of data that people won't share, so I won't call it overspend. I'll just call it right spending.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ken. You know, you can overspend on anything if you're doing it wrong, right? And using the label, right? And so I personally think that all of these decisions should be thought of as investments, but actually made sure they link so that they really are linked to financial outcomes, so that they really are truly investments. And the problem is, as we're still getting better, right? There are, as Ken said, there's lots of other data that needs to be put in to triangulate really where we're headed and where we should be headed. And the other piece that's not done very well is we don't use CX very well to actually have customer experience, business process innovation, or business model innovation for that matter, the whole company. Because we tend to treat these things as separate. Well, the problem is you have to make sure the company is structured in such a way to deliver and get the returns you really want. And that really requires, this being where you link up what it is that the customer is looking for, and the experience you're offering them with what your business model is. And sometimes you just have to change it. That's the one thing that I will say that Amazon does very well, is they're passionately customer focused and they're testing things all the time. And in their innovation strategy, the way their innovations actually work and the way they stay on track is before they actually start on the innovation, they write the press release for the innovation. That's not a joke. You have to write a press release before you actually do it. And that press release has to focus on why the customer should care, right? Because nobody wants to hear about your process. They want to hear why you should care. If we started thinking about that when we do our CX, write our press release in our head, why would they care? It would eliminate a lot of these overspending problems, because you wouldn't do it because it's cool. You focus on what the customer cares about.
Yeah,
That's a
absolutely.
really awesome point. I really like that. And you're totally right. Amazon actually isn't the only one. I know Tesla does that too. They put out a lot of their press releases before they even have a brand new car or something that they're rolling out, or like a new roof thing that they're solar roof panels that they're doing. So that is really helps people focusing the priority of what really matters when it comes to creating, you know, transformation and real change. So that's awesome. Last question for you both here. The American Innovation Index sounds interesting. Where can I learn more?
Well, I mean, you probably have the best expert on the other end of the line right here in Tim. So
First of all,
I'll let him answer.
you can always reach out to me. I'm at St. John's. So you can easily find me at the St. John's Business School, which is the Tobin School of Management. But if you want a very simple way to just go and get information, there's a website that actually has it on there, and that is, all you have to put is AmericanInnovationIndex.com, all one word, and it'll at least lead you to the homepage where you can get the actual baseline benchmarks, right, where the kind of the way the American Customer Satisfaction Index is laid out. And you can look and see who's doing what by year, but all you have to do is contact us. But seriously, I'm very easy to reach. Just reach out to me.
Well, that's great. And just to confirm, that was AmericanInnovationIndex.org.
It's com.
Oh, okay, .com. All right, my bad. I wrote the wrong one in the chat.
And also you can find them on Twitter, and they have some great blurbs on Twitter that come out on a regular basis. And don't ask me how I know, but it's because I have to follow it. So it's very interesting to me. So
Okay.
is there anything else that has come in?
No, those are all the questions we have for today. So we'll, and if you have any last words or thoughts, feel free to go ahead and share. If not, we can go ahead and wrap up.
No, we'll give people back their a couple of minutes to get on to the next part of their day. And I do thank you for attending.
Thanks so much. Ken, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much, Tim, and for being here as well. Certainly learned a lot, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll have a recording, and also we'll have a blog with the FAQs and everything ready to go. So we'll share that after the webinar. So do look forward to seeing that in your email. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.